Hey there, Sugar developers. I'm Lauren Schaefer, and today I want to talk to you about the Sugar REST API. When you want to build an integration with Sugar, the REST API is a great place to start. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to authenticate using an HTTP request, and then how to perform each of the CRUD, create, read, update, and delete operations. Now, I've done a few things behind the scenes to help make this tutorial go a little bit smoother. So first, I installed the Professor M package into my locally running instance of Sugar, and I inserted all of the Professor M sample data. Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about when I say Professor M, check out the links below. We've got great videos and documentation that'll explain what the Professor M scenario is and how to install it step by step. So if you don't know about the Professor M scenario, go check out those links and then come back here. All right, for those of you still with me, second thing I did to make this tutorial go smoother was I installed Postman. Now, when you want to execute your own REST API calls, it's totally up to you what application or programming language you want to use. Today, I'm going to use Postman. Third, I imported a Postman collection of API calls, so you don't have to watch me hand type them out during this video. Fourth and finally, I set up a Postman environment where I've stored some environment variables that I'll be using throughout this video. As you can see, I've set up my URL for my locally running instance of Sugar and the username and password for my administrative user. I've also created my access token, refresh token, and applicant ID variables, and I'll be setting the values for those a little bit later. All right, so let's jump right in with our first API call. Let's authenticate. Sugar uses two-legged OAuth 2 for authentication. So the way we want to authenticate is use a post request, and we're going to post to the token endpoint. Let's take a look at the body of the request. We're going to set our grant type to password, and then we're going to send over things like our client ID, client secret, username, password, and platform. Now, if you're not familiar with Postman, you might be wondering what these curly braced strings are. Those are actually our environment variables that we set a moment ago in our Postman environment. When we execute the request, Postman is going to take care of replacing those strings with the values set in our Postman environment. So let's go ahead and send this request. I'm going to scroll down so we can see the body. Let's take a look at what came back. We can see we've got things like the access token and refresh token, and those both expire after a certain amount of time. Now, in later requests, instead of sending over our username and password, we're going to send over this access token. So I'm going to go ahead and copy it and store it inside of our Postman environment. Now, you'll notice that our access token is going to expire before our refresh token. So the idea here is that if you make a request and you get a response saying that your token has expired, what you want to do is get a new token using your refresh token. So I'm going to go ahead and store the refresh token, and let me show you how to use it. So moving on to our next API call, what we would do is actually do a post to the very same endpoint, that token endpoint. And in the body of the request, instead of setting the grant type to password, we're going to set it to refresh token. And we're also going to send over that refresh token we just set in our Postman environment. So let me send that just so you can see what the response looks like. It's actually pretty much identical to what we just got a moment ago. We've got a new access token and a new refresh token. Now, what this did is it invalidated our old access token. So I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste those new values so we'll be able to use them in later requests. I'll go ahead and copy our refresh token so we've got the latest, but don't worry, this video is not going to be so long that we're going to need to use it. All right, so that's how we authenticate. Let's jump into the fun stuff, our CRUD operations, starting with create. So if you'll think back to the Professor M scenario, we renamed the leads module to applicants. So this applicants module is used to store applicants for the Professor M School for Gifted Coders. So if we want to create a new applicant, what we would do is do a post request to the leads endpoint. I'm going to point out the header here. You can see we're sending over a header with a key of OAuth token, and the value is that access token that we got just a moment ago from our authentication request. Now, I'm not going to point this out in all of our later requests, but just know that this header is being sent in all of these requests. So let's take a look at the body of this request. I'm sending over some information that I think is important that I want to store about my new applicant. Now there's a lot of data that I could send over that I'm not going to. It's up to you how much data you want to send. So let's create a new applicant whose name is Jessie Graff. I'm going to send the request and let's take a look at the response body. First thing we see is our applicant ID. So this is the record ID in Sugar associated with this particular applicant. We can see information about our applicant like her name. The data was entered and modified. Super handy that Sugar does that for us automatically. We can see the administrator was the last person to do the modification. And if I keep scrolling, we'll see lots of information about Jessie, like her first name and her last name. And we also see there's a lot of data that I did not set that just has empty strings. So we could have set things like her Facebook, her Twitter, her Google+, and we can do that later as well. So I'll just keep scrolling. And we can see her alias is Tumbleweed. So this is a really big record. There's a lot of information we could associate with this particular applicant. Now I'm going to scroll back up to the top of her record, and I'm actually going to copy this ID and store it in our environment because we're going to use it in later requests. All right, so that's how we do a create. Let's move on to reads. I'm going to show you a variety of ways to do read requests. These are all going to use gets. So the easiest way to do a read is to use the record ID. So we're going to do a get on the leads endpoint with the applicant ID. I'm going to press send. And here we get Jessie's big long record again. So we'll see, we can scroll a bit. There's her name. There's her description, very strong ninja. It's her full record. Now let's say you don't know the record ID that you want. You just want to do some browsing. You want to get a list of all of the applicants. What you can do is do a get request on the leads endpoint and then just don't include the applicant ID here. So let me send that. And we actually get a really long request. So we can see, here's Jessie's record. Here's Jamie Ron's record. Here's Ronnie LaFlame's record. And maybe hard to see, but there's a really long scroll bar here. So here's how we can just do an easy browse of the records. Now, let's say we want to make this a little bit easier to look at. We don't need those full records. So let's set some parameters. So here, let's set the fields we want to get back to name, alias, and status description. And let's say we only want to get back the first 5 records. So we'll set max num to 5. Okay, so this is a lot easier to look at. Here we can see Jessie, Jamie, Ronnie, Iggy, and Brian. Now, we set the max num to 5, and you might be wondering, well, how do we know if there are more records? Well, that's what this next offset field tells us. It tells us at offset of 5, there are more records. So let's go check out what those are. So in order to get page 2 of the results, we're going to send the exact same request we did. This is all identical to before, but we're going to add an extra parameter. We're going to set the offset to 5. And this gives us our next 5 results. So we can see Tony, Roy, Wayne, Kate, and Annette. Now we see there's another offset of 10 where there are more records. So let's go check those out. I'm just going to update this offset from 5 to 10 and rerun the request. Here we can see Jimmy, Val, Simone, and Janice. Now if I scroll back up to the top of this response, we'll see the next offset is set to -1. And that means we have found all the results. So if you want to paginate your results, this is an easy way to do it. You can set how many items per page you want, and then keep looping through the results until you get that offset of -1. Now, let's say you don't want to browse. You kind of have an idea of what you're looking for. You want to look for a record who has a particular field set. So let's say you want to look for someone whose alias is equal to Tumbleweed. You set this, we're going to use this filter parameter. And then to keep things easy to look at, I'm going to limit how many fields we get back. And here we can see we've got Jessie Graff back. Her alias is in fact Tumbleweed. And we know we've gotten all the records in this response because that offset is set to -1. Now, let's say we aren't quite sure exactly what the alias is, but we know that it starts with the letter T. We can use this handy starts operator in order to do that search. Now, there are actually a lot of operators you can use. You can check out the developer guide to see what all of your options are. So let's execute this request. And we can see we've got a record whose alias is tumbleweed, as we expected. And we also found we have a record whose alias is the hunk. All right, so that's a variety of way to do reads. We did a read by ID. We did just a read, a general browse. We paginated those results. And then we also did some read by searching for particular fields. All right, let's move on to update. So you'll notice instead of doing a post or a get, we're going to do a put for an update. And we're going to do a put to the leads endpoint, and we're going to send over the applicant ID indicating which record we want to update. The body of request is going to have the information that we want to update. So here we're updating our status description to be more ninja-like reflexes than we initially thought. Now, if you wanted to update more than one field at a time, you certainly could. You could just put it in here, make a comma-separated list of whatever it is you want to update. I'm only going to update the one field, so I'll send that request. And here we get back Jessie's full record. And let's see. Here is her updated description, just as we hoped. All right, so create, read, update. The last thing we want to do is a little bit of cleanup. We want to do a delete. So here we're going to do a delete request. And we're going to delete using the leads endpoint, and we're going to send over that applicant ID. Our body is going to be completely empty because all we're doing is doing a delete to that applicant. All right, we've sent our request, and the response is the ID of the record that was deleted. So in this tutorial, let's review what we've done. We have learned how to authenticate and get an access token. We learned how to use a refresh token to get a new access token. And then we've gone through how to perform each of the CRUD, create, read, update, and delete operations. I hope you enjoy getting to use the REST API yourself.